Well, thank you, Suyen, and I'm delighted to be here with Mitra. We've been having some conversations about Edna recently, and I have to say it feels really, I don't know, serendipitous or something to be here talking about Edna's work tonight, because she was one of the first artists I met when I moved to Philadelphia in 2002, and it was right around the time. If you don't mind, I get a little personal here. It was right around the time when the Art of the Steal movie was coming out, and there was a lot of discussion about should the Barnes move? Oh, it's a terrible thing. It's the worst thing ever. And a lot of artists I know particularly felt really strongly, having taken classes there and things, that it really shouldn't move. And they were very devastated about it. And it was so interesting to me to meet Edna, who was definitely up there in years. And immediately she said to me, oh no, no problem with this. This is, life goes on, things change, things move. And I was just so struck by that, because I think it's really indicative of Edna as a person, as an artist. She didn't stay in an op mode. And for her, it was so interesting to me that she was included in some of the very first shows in 1965, where that idea of defining the art that looks like that was starting to be defined as op art. She was included in the show in Fort Worth, and she was included in the show in Des Moines, and she was included in the show here at the Philadelphia Art Alliance, but she wasn't, of course, included in the MoMA show, which was all boys except Bridget Riley. Supposedly because, and maybe it's true, William Seitz didn't know about her work in time, and the checklist was already fixed. I don't know if I believe that or not. But what I was really struck by was she talked about that it was really an inadequate term, that what she was really doing and what she was really interested in, and what she felt a lot of the other artists who were exploring this were interested in, was the broader idea of perception, not the sort of physical physiognomy of the effect on the eye, but the whole broader idea really of how we see and what we see, and the dynamics of space and color and relationships in a sort of grand philosophical way. I mean, it's the kind of thing that led to her founding of the Form Forum, where she brought together scientists and philosophers and scholars of all different disciplines to sort of share their different perspectives and how to experience things. And I think it also speaks to the kind of what she took away from looking in her world travels of her experiences in geometric abstraction in forms in Greece and Egypt and all over, and this sort of universal spirituality of some of that she really saw it as part of a universal whole, breaking it down into the universe into these component parts that had deep meaning, unattached to an object form. So anyway, that's sort of how I came to Edna's work, and she was one of the first artists I met. I became very intrigued. I was also, one of my areas of great interest is screen printing, and that wall will knock your socks off around the corner. I also think that's a really great wall. Whoever decided to hang that's a really great wall, because I think it also, while initially it might ring a bell with op, if you really look carefully and stand in front of each one and you start to get dizzy and start to see other colors coming forward, you start to really understand her investigations of perception. And one of my favorite works, there's both the painting and a screen print version at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, is color motion, which is black and white. And if you see it in reproduction, you're like, why is this called color motion? But if you stand in front of it for about 5 minutes, you'll start to see greens and purples and all kinds of things that come in front of your eyes. And that's part of what is missed, I think, when it's sort of lumped into an op art experience. And I think for Edna too, she is always, and we've talked some about this, and we've talked about it with Suyen a lot too, from some of her titles, and like the Martin Luther King tribute to King, she was really responding to all of the events in the world around her. It's abstraction, but it has deeper meanings. And one of the things I always wondered about color motion, because it is from sort of the movement, the first round of civil rights movement, was that to me it always had this sort of undercurrent of not everything is black and white. It's not really black and white. The world is nuanced. And I think that her work moves towards a more nuanced subtleties as she moves on in her geometric abstraction. So that's sort of where I have come to appreciate, how I've come to appreciate Edna's art. I can't believe I had never heard of her until I came here. I think that's a common remark that people make. And now it's very interesting, having moved from Philadelphia to the National Gallery, where with all museums, as Mitra and I have also been discussing, women are finally at the forefront of, oh my God, we didn't collect enough work by women artists. We need to get work by women artists. Look at all these people that we left out of the conversation. This changes our whole idea of what happened with geometric abstraction in that period, if we start looking at internationally. And that's the other thing I've been finding really interesting now that I'm looking at Edna in a broader context too, is with the greater recognition of a lot of women artists working in Latin America, like Ligia Clark and Ligia Pape, both of whom are roughly Edna's same generation, and Gego. And I think for me, I'm really interested in finding ways to put Edna's work in new contexts like that for a national audience, so that we really do start to think about, what did these folks who were left out of the initial rounds of looking at these movements bring to the table, and how does it change our view of those? And now Mitra's going to talk about her project.
So I am indeed newer to Edna, and I'm going to pause for a moment to offer just a few thanks, because I'm so grateful for this opportunity to spend time thinking, studying, and really investigating, like truly delving into Edna's work. And so I wanted to say that it's a delight for me to be here in conversation with Shelley, who knew Edna. It's a delight for me to be here in a room with so many members of Edna's community, the Philadelphia community, those who were her dear friends, those who were her colleagues, those who didn't know her, but but who were Philadelphians. And when I said, I'm coming to Philadelphia, they said, what are you doing? I said, I'm studying Edna. And they say, oh, of course, Edna Andrade, because in Philadelphia, she is a canonical figure. And I love that about her. So it's a delight for me to be here, and I want to open with profound gratitude to Suyan Locks for this opportunity, and to note that she is carrying on the legacy of Marion Locks, who I imagine played this role for many of you that Suyan has played for me in introducing me to Edna Andrade's work. I began at the Princeton University Art Museums in the fall of 2016, and Suyan mounted an exhibition of Edna's paintings in 2017 and said, you need to see this. And I came down, and it was one of those moments. Eleanor Hartney asked me how I started on Edna, and I said, well, you know, every once in a while as an art historian or curator, you find an artist where you think, I found something. And I had that instant sense that from Edna, you could draw these rays to light and space, to kineticism, to op art, to geometric abstraction, to the Bauhaus, to mathematics and architecture, and some of the things that I immediately saw in her work. And yet there was something truly distinctive about her voice, so that even while it looked like so many things, even while it seemed to call into reference so many other artists or other movements, there was something truly distinctive, truly unique, and something that was a voice unto herself, unto her approach. And so that became the catalyst, the prompt. And I haven't stopped, Suyan can tell you, it's talking about her sense. And Suyan, like every good leader is like, so what's taking you so long? Get the lead out. Let's see enough talk, a little more action. And so I want to thank the entire team at Locke's Gallery, whose support of my research and of this evening has been essential. And I want to thank and acknowledge my curatorial colleague at Harvard, Madeline Turner, who it's now that I have gone to become the head of modern contemporary at Harvard, that I've been joined by her, she who is a postdoctoral curatorial fellow in contemporary drawing. And it's that partnership, and it's so important to have these intellectual partners and people who can have a conversation with you, has met my enthusiasm and energy with an energy and an intellect that has allowed me to delve into this rich subject. And then finally, I want to thank all of you, because I see this as a call to her community to come to me with anecdotes and stories and archival references and artworks and all of the things that I hope will fuel future study, that I hope will become an exhibition proposal and for deeper investigation of her practice. So I have just begun this week delving into the archives of Edna Andrade, which are spread across, in so far my estimation, the major repositories are the Archives of American Art in Washington, D.C., the archives of the University of the Arts, where she taught here in Philadelphia, and her estate, which is represented by Locke's Gallery. And so I've collected a couple of my most favorite attributes from the archives so far. On the occasion of the 2003 opening of an exhibition of Edna's work at the ICA, and de Harnoncourt toasted the artist, commenting that Edna's command of line and color and form is deeply distinctive, like her voice. It is abstract and elegant, intensely considered, spare but not austere, and often full of joy. And I thought, if I see what Anne sees, I'm on the right track. I also thought that why I wanted to read that quote is that it ends with this idea of joy. And I think that there's something distinctively playful about the way that Edna Andrade's work calls different kinds of thinking and practice together. And I think we see this in her most complex compositions, but also in her drawings and her studies. And so that is something that I really has been, I think it's part of what's motivated me and given me this sense of a spirit of something to discover further in her work. I've spent much of my career at university art museums. My first job as an assistant curator in 2000 was at a university art museum, and I've spent the last decade at university art museums. And there's a particular privilege to studying and discussing art in a context that engages it as a platform for the liberal arts, for the merging of the humanities, the applied sciences, and the hard sciences. And so there was something about Edna's work that seemed to me to speak to that kind of context, to the place where thinking about pictorial space from the perspective of a theoretician or a mathematician, from the perspective of an engineer who is building structures, and from the perspective of an artist who is interested in trajectories of illusionistic space and flat space came together. And when in 2017 at Princeton, there was a huge conversation around that concept of design thinking. And design thinking being a way that the humanities could hold hands with the growing number of students who wanted to study engineering or computer and digital, arts. And so there was a real call for finding artists and subjects and curriculum that would do this kind of practice, this practice of design thinking. And that was something that I saw in Edna's work. And I've also always been interested in the dual legacy of artists whose legacy, whose influence, whose impact, whose role in art history is shared between their artwork and their role as a professor. So figures like Moholy-Nagy or Josef Albers or Edna Andrade, whose students carry on a philosophy of looking and of making that then has these ripple effects and creates constellations out through the art world. And it's those, we know those artists' work, and their work has this extended influence, in fact, through their practice as a teacher. And I remember, I'm sure there are people who knew Edna as a teacher here in this room. And I remember when I first started, after I first discovered Edna through Su Yung, and I went back and I was talking about her incessantly. And we, shortly thereafter, Princeton had the great fortune of bringing one of her paintings, Winter Veils, into the collection. And I tried to get it on view as many times as I could thereafter. And one of our art handlers was like, "Oh, Edna, I remember her. I remember her as a professor." And I thought, like, this is it. This is like when you can meet the students and the network and the legacy of an artist who are themselves artists, who carry on that way of looking. And my most favorite quote from the archives thus far comes from her 1936 scholarship application to get a tuition, scholarship for tuition from the Pennsylvania Academy for Arts. And in the section titled "The Purpose in Studying Art," when answering the question, "What do you expect to make of studying art?" Edna answered, "The most possible." And from everything I've heard of her, that's exactly how clear-minded, tenacious, determined, and direct she carried on to be. So having arrived at Harvard, I've become really interested in the ways that Edna's practice itself, how can we define, now that I'm in the archives, how can we define this thing that I saw in her art that is ineffable, but that I saw as a distinctive voice? And I think that now that I'm delving into the archives, it comes down to a set of principles that I've started to identify. One is an interest in world cultures. And Shelley talked about her traveling. In 1936 and 1938, at a time when her report cards were still addressed to her father and sent home to him to report on her progress in school, she garnered 2 travel fellowships. And during the rise of fascism in Europe, she set out for Europe as an independent, very young college student to travel through Athens, through Greece, to Cairo, and conducted her own world tour on a shoestring budget to see the world. And she came back and she writes these detailed notes of what she saw, of the patterns, of the colors, of the symmetries. When we were in the University of the Arts Archive this morning, we found these incredible drawings she did for a commission of a set of cruise ships, where she's drawing Indonesian and Polynesian sculptures with the exactitude of an architectural plan, as if for an HVAC system within the ducts or the structural beams that would hold up the floors. And so you're getting not just a sketch of the sculpture, but it in relief of what would you call it? A cross view from every angle, a section. Yes, that's exactly the word I was looking for. A section, a cross view from the top. And so she's got this very this sense of the world being her visual vocabulary very early on. The second thing is her work as in the architecture firm of her husband, Preston Andy Andrade. And from 1954 to 61, she's working in his firm doing all of these very technical drawings. So even though her training at PAFA was, for the most part, academic, a traditional academic training, has this skill. And so we also were seeing in the archives these architectural drawings that have precision of line that is mind-boggling, a capacity to hold the graphite and do a whole variety, a whole tonal range of different shades, an understanding of perspective, but also how to manipulate perspective. One of the most incredible drawings we saw this morning was as if it was in perfect linear perspective and a fishbowl at the same time, looking into a courtyard, because the planes of the building came out like wings and yet had this exacting linear set of floors and windows and geometric structures. And then we saw the reflection from the frontal windows on these winged sides. And I thought, you take that and then you go 30 years later and you understand how she's starting to layer geometric forms from like one pattern of geometric forms on top of another, on top of a third, to create some of her most complex linear compositions in the 80s and 90s with layered in pieces of foil. And that training is there in the 1950s from working with architectural tools. I also found this great photograph down in DC of Edna painting one of her geometric paintings with one of those long styluses that you see 17th century still life painters, right? So to steady her hand, so she's leaned over this giant geometric painting with two stabilizing staffs, holding her hands so that she can get that exacting hard edge geometric line. And I thought, this is architecture. She had a foundation of an architecture. So it's not just an idea, it's like actual practice. Her methodology is that of an architect. And then the third is mathematics, which Shelley mentioned also comes up in the forum that she is one of the organizing members of in 1979. But way, way earlier than that, when you go back to her curricular files, you can see that she's collecting up stacks of different geometric principles and mathematical principles to teach essentially geometry in her foundations courses. And then finally, to come back, and I'll wrap it up, I promise, to design thinking, it's the way that all of these things indeed come together for her. So, and the way that then becomes a way that we can understand the transformation of arts education in the 20th century and its bridge from Europe to the Americas, both the United States at schools like Harvard or the Arts Institute in Chicago, or various schools that inherited some of these ideas about how to develop a way of training students in the arts that was different than a traditional academic training, but also to Latin America and to the schools and the artistic treatises and principles that came to shape modernist movements in Venezuela, in Argentina, at UNAM in Mexico City. And so to bring it back to Harvard, because that's what the context in which I'm thinking now, I was delighted to discover that from 1939 to 41, just after she graduates from art school in 37, and then again in 38, she returns from her second travel overseas in 38, and she immediately gets a job teaching at the Newcomb Memorial College, which was the women's college associated with Tulane. And there at Newcomb, she's teaching alongside Robin Field, who had trained under Gropius at Harvard. And Gropius had come to Harvard just in 1937, Walter Gropius was one of the founding figures of the Bauhaus, arguably one of the most famous schools for revolutionizing creating a modernist approach to the arts and to arts training in Weimar, Germany. And he had left in 1928 for England, and in 1937 comes to Cambridge and in order to lead the Graduate School of Design, which had just the prior year merged the three fields of architecture, urban planning, and landscape architecture. So bringing together the foundations of a formalist and abstract training with material training in ceramics and architecture and drawing and the arts in order to think about how modernism and modern art could also be applied to the landscape, applied to architecture, applied to design. And that he then becomes a teacher of Robin Field, and Robin Field comes to Newcomb College just at the time that Edna is also there. And so for those 2 years, they train side by side, and that really opens up a different way of thinking about artistic training from the academic to an idea of art and the study of art as being discursive, about being about the exploration of materials and the experimentation of with materials. Edna goes on to, in 1942, she gets married in 41. In 42, she and her husband moved to Washington, D.C. to work for the OSS, a part of the State Department. And at that time, her supervisor is Eros Saarinen, the famous architect, designer of the St. Louis Arch. And whatnot. And this is another kind of layer on this entire philosophy of modernism and design thinking as being about exploration and discursiveness. Harvard Art Museum's collection, because of the relationship to Gropius, holds one of the first and largest collections of artworks and studies from the Bauhaus. In addition, the Harvard collection contains drawings and studies from Newcomb College, reflecting the way that idea of being a teacher or being in an educational institution is being a point within a constellation. And that idea that as a teacher, your ideas are carried out by your students and then to other students and then to other students. And so I'm interested in how Edna then becomes a figure, a point within that constellation. And the thing that I'm still looking for and still searching for is how that comes around. She cites Josef Albers, who is also an important foundational figure at the Bauhaus, as one of her influences, and is asked, in fact, to give remarks when he's given an honorary doctorate in 1976 by UPenn. He passes away just a few months before the May 1976 when she's scheduled to give those remarks. And so she never meets him, but she meets Annie Albers at that time and forms a connection with her. And so that's something that I'd like to trace through that period. And that's in 76 is also an incredibly important year for a lot of kinetic arts as it's moving between Argentina, Venezuela, Caracas, and Paris, in addition to New York. And so And that's the years just before she forms the Forum Forum,
Yeah.
and all of these kinds of things that we can find rooted in the 30s and through the 50s. She takes up as a field, as a discussion, and as a platform for the way that she's operating in the art scene at that moment. And so some of the questions that I am now continuing on to pursue are, how can we create a meaningful or factual, grounded in some of the collections and archives, connection between some of these points that seem, in fact, very promising and, seductive.
Well, I think you've come across some really interesting ideas, Mitra, and I'm excited too, because I've not had the opportunity to do the deep dive that you're now doing, and it's great that you're doing this. It's long overdue. But some of listening to you and in just thinking about her work, in the last year or so, several things have been striking to me about comments that she's made that make her so relevant for this current moment too. Mm-hmm. And one of them is when she was bemoaning the fact, and I can't remember, I think it was in the 80s or the 90s, that she was bemoaning the fact that how already things were getting too separate and too expertise oriented, and there wasn't enough sort of cross-disciplinary interaction within the art school, that everybody was doing their own thing, and that really concerned her. And I think it was earlier, because I think that was part of what initiated the forum. And which is something that is happening today, as you alluded to, particularly in university museums, trying to bring other disciplines back to the museum to use the collections in different ways. You have mathematical students coming in, you have biology students coming in, and even getting much more involved in museums. I was also really struck, and this is, I'm sure many of you are familiar with her remark that she made about how it was really through teaching her students 2D design that led to a lot of and inspired her own work. And I think one of the things that has always struck me, it doesn't even matter what the discipline is, the best teachers are always those who continue to learn from their students. It's not just a one-way street, it's a two-way street. And I think that is, and that in, what we started talking about at the beginning in terms of sort of her innate curiosity and interest in continuing to grow, part of that is what made her a good teacher.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, and a lot, as we know, I'm speaking like I'm an artist, but there are many in the room I know, often you're teaching because you cannot survive on your art alone, but there are those special teachers that are engaged and realize and understand how that fuels their own energy and inspiration. The other things that I've been thinking about a lot in terms of our current moment is, I think it was on her 90th birthday, there was a quote, I think it was in the Inquirer, or maybe it was earlier, she was talking about how with everything going on in the world, there was, and the craziness of it all, this structured process that she has, this very disciplined sort of, careful rendering and layering and building out of geometric abstraction is very comforting.
Yeah.
In a way, that it gives you agency to control something. And I thought that was really fascinating. And I think, boy, that, like, looking at this right now, isn't there something really peaceful? Like, there's just something that makes you feel good about looking at her art right now. And I think that's part of it for us in this moment. And some of it is very joyful, but it's like it makes sense. It has some sort of, it has some system to it that's logical in some way.
And I think it's also like that joy, or the thing that excited me was that you see her, and it just to exactly the point of what you're saying, Shelley, is you see her truly exploring, you see her experimenting, you see her playing, you see her learning through the process of making her works. And so it's also what keeps, like, one of the reviews of her 1974 exhibition here at Marion Locke's Gallery at that time, In conjunction with the original focus, the review referred to the freshness and the wit of her work. It was a drawing show predominantly then, as Suyeon has mounted today in honor of that 50th anniversary. And I feel like that was what excited me. That's where I saw that design thinking, but it's also what made her such a great teacher, is that it never becomes redundant or stayed. It's always in this, she's always exploring. And I think it's what makes her so fun to study too, because like every time we find some new document or some new archive, you see some element that you can recognize from her work. And you can see how she's constantly collecting up even like a geometric shape or a way of laying down lines. And then she's thinking like, oh, that's interesting. And then what can I do with that? And so it never goes into, it's not a formula. It never becomes an algorithm.
No, but
like some minimalism will, it's not like how many things can I do with a cube? It's like, how many things can I do, period.
It's funny because I've thought about her work a lot in terms of what she does for geometric abstraction is kind of what Jasper Johns did for oil cans and hangers. It's like, you think you know this object. Ha, I'll show you. You don't really know what this object is about.